Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Megan Abbott. Megan is the best-selling, award-winning author of 11 novels. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times Magazine, The Guardian, and The Believer. Her novel, The Turnout, was a New York Times bestseller, a Read with Jenna book club pick, and a Los Angeles Times Book Prize winner. It also earned her finalist recognitions for the International Thriller Writers Award, the Joyce Carol Oates Prize, and has also been optioned for TV by the producer of Sharp Objects. Dare Me was featured multiple times in the New York Times 10 Best Books of the 21st Century piece. Television rights to Dorado Drive, her newest, were recently optioned by A24, who did Euphoria and Beef, with Abbott attached to write. In addition, she is the co-creator and executive producer of USA's adaptation of Dare Me and was a staff writer on HBO's David Simon show, The Deuce. Abbott lives in New York City. Wow, Megan, woo, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. That's too long of a bio. I'm
It's
sorry.
well, there's just so much good stuff. Like, what do you trim? What incredible accolades do we take out? So, and I have my book. And I have my book backwards and upside down. Today we are going to talk about El Dorado Drive, which is Megan's newest and, in true Megan form, absolutely fantastic. Such a thrilling read, so deep and dark and fabulous. So before we ask all the questions we want to hear about, Megan, will you tell our listeners a little bit about El Dorado Drive?
Yes, I sort of became fascinated during the pandemic about hearing about all these women that were involved in various money-making schemes, which is sort of a story as old as time. I think going back to Mary Kay Cosmetics and Tupperware, but they often take on a darker energy, and particularly sort of suburban women who sort of ladies who lunch, etc. And I thought that was sort of so fascinating and what the dynamics were in a group of women like that. So that was sort of the original inspiration. And then there was a case in Connecticut about a woman who was involved in one of those and then came to a very unfortunate end. So all of that sort of was swirling in my brain. So I started to conceive of a book. The first time I've ever set one in my hometown, just outside of Detroit, and about a woman who sort of raised in sort of comparative wealth who lose their husbands lose their job during the recession and they all need to make money. So it's about three sisters at the center of one of these money-making operations.
And it is, I mean, I think that's the selection of Detroit, which I did not know was your hometown, but it makes so much sense, right? Because there was this sort of evaporation of an entire class of wealth when the sort of automotive industry went, sideways.
Right.
Okay, so I'm curious, because obviously with all of your books, this is the first time I've had Megan on the show, so I have so many questions. But and I'm a huge fan, and also I just got off the phone with Tessa Wagert, who's like, she's one of my favorites. Tell her I say hi. So you have a huge fan base even amongst your peers, which is super, super fun. But where does sort of idea, it sounds like to me like that this idea came sort of from sort of more general, not a specific situation, but a general sort of thing that happened with women, or it happens, has, as you said, it happens as old as Tupperware and Mary Kay. Is that sort of how ideas come to you? Is it a question of sort of a sort of a people, or is it sometimes more specific? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's always sort of mysterious, isn't it? It's usually this sort of swirl, and then something takes on a particular energy. And in this case, I think I was interested in writing about women in their 40s and 50s who were in some ways trying to restart their life, and so that this was sort of the perfect vehicle. And I was particularly interested in the way that women their relationship to money, which I think is so complex because it's never really about money, right? It's also about money, but at its heart, it's often about security, independence, power, etc., and how something like this, where you're suddenly making a lot of money, how it would affect them differently in their relationships to each other. So once I started to think on those terms, it became this great way to sort of illuminate the different women, particularly the three main sisters who all grew up in comparative wealth, and now none of them have it anymore. So we get the sister dynamics overlaid.
Right.
Like, yeah, this, glory days are gone, and then this, competitive pursuit.
And I think it is interesting because so the three sisters, Deborah is the oldest and Pam is sort of our sort of main focus character, and then Harper is the straggler. And what I in Pam, of course, has just gone through a terrible divorce. And so she's dealing with, like you said, this sort of, and it is having also gone through a divorce in the last few years, like there is this sense of like you were, as a woman, as like most women, I took a back seat to my husband's primary job, also as a writer. Well, first of all, it's easier to take a back seat because you have so much flexibility. Also, we know that this is not the most lucrative career, so it's also easier to take a back seat because you're less likely to sort of have the, primary job. And it does that sense of loss that Pam feels from having the security of marriage with Doug is so real. And I think, as you said, women deal with that, and even married, Deborah and her husband Perry are going through something because Perry is sick. And it is, we are sort of, for whatever reason, we are sort of backseated to those career choices, earlier in marriage. And obviously, I think mostly because of children, right? Um,
Right. And just I think it's true. There's so many women who, especially ones who got married when they were young in their 20s and they hadn't really launched their career yet. And then and I think this is less true for younger people now. I mean, I think this is in some ways not going to be this way again. First of all, because there's, it's a very calamitous economic, situation anyway now. And there aren't those jobs that people have now for 40 years where they get the gold watch at the end. So that's gone too. But I think, I was married in my early 20s too, and I remember when I got divorced, this is like a therapy session, but it was this sense of like I've been married, I was a kid when I got married, and like how do I restart my life? And there's something about a lot of women's careers, writing being an example of one, that somehow is diminished, in opposition to, the job of some of these men, which feels more official somehow, and primary breadwinner. So I think it gets all tied up with notions of self and security and self-image. And I think for Pam, she never really got started, and now she's found something she's really good at, and it feels like she's finally found her thing, which is making enormous amounts of money in dubious legal.
right, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And her ex is, he's, kind of a dick, right? About money and about,
Yeah.
and then she has this, she has two kids, one who's going to college, which, and then this daughter at home who's, these teenage daughters. I mean, to be honest, Megan, Killer Women is often therapy for myself as well as for the listeners. But I do think it is, and you're right. I think it's a totally different situation now. I think you also have I recall you have a child as well, who's,
No, yeah, no, no, I don't have any
oh,
kids,
you
which is
don't have kids. Okay.
no, that's probably why I can write
Conflating
about
you with somebody else then.
yeah.
But at any rate, the younger generation, I know I have a 25-year-old daughter, and yeah, her outlook on this whole thing is quite different. But yeah, getting married, I mean, that is sort of what we did, and I feel like we are the tail end of that generation, but we didn't have I mean, it was sort of like, I felt like when I got married at 23, and I kind of felt like, oh, you got to grab a guy before, I don't know what I thought. Like they were like meat that was expiring, and I grab the best cut on sale before, But that was sort of the image I had at that age. So it's so strange.
And if you know, like Pam, married this guy who was on this massive upward
Right,
track.
right.
So it felt like, I'm a big fan of the Real Housewives TV shows, and you see this all the time. This is a common trope where they marry someone young who is, in finance or a high profile attorney, whatever it is, something that's very intense and the money is abundant. And then what happens when that's all taken away and your whole lifestyle changes in an instant? And I think, she's got this teenage daughter who is of the younger generation is completely mystified by this whole dinosaur of a way of imagining one's life. So it brought up, for a crime novel, and I think crime novels always do this, they illuminate these things in women's lives that don't get, proper treatment maybe in other genres. And that they don't get, or in the culture in general, like these sort of really things you're not supposed to talk about. And one of them is money, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
the way I was raised. Don't count other people's money.
Yeah.
Don't talk about how much things cost. And so it's this sort of weirdly forbidden space.
Which we like to just dig in and open up.
Yes.
And the other thing that I think is interesting is, women are such, we're such a sharing, we share so naturally, and it's so becomes so important to sort of our psyche to kind of have those bonds with other women, and yet we're also sort of each other's worst enemies, right? I mean, in many, and sisters in particular, I think,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you have sisters, but there is the dynamic between the three of them feels so, and I only have one sister, but the dynamic feels so so honest and so authentic because there's all this comparison. Your parents compare you, society compares you, you compare, you're always comparing each other.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like another way we undercut each other's self-worth.
That's right. I think, even the order, oldest, middle, youngest, all that stuff has a huge impact. I was just reading something in the New York Times this past weekend about how our sibling relationships may be the most important, that have the biggest effect on us. And I kind of think that's true. And I don't have sisters. I have one older brother. So it's a very different dynamic. I think with sisters, it's different models of womanhood that you see, and who's doing something this way. Harper, the youngest, she's never lived this sort of conventional life. She's
Right.
really an outlier, and so I think there's a lot of judgment between and among them about the choices they've made, even if there's an enormous amount of love there. I mean, that's always the complexity of sisters.
Right.
It's all overlaid, and there's all these past grievances that never really go away and sort
Right.
of before.
And it's interesting too. I read the same article, which I thought was really interesting. And I also feel like there's this idea, that we spend so much energy on who our parents were, right? But there's a very, your parent, if you're the firstborn, you are directly, right, in contact with your parents. But if you're not the firstborn, then there's this, you are reflected off of your sibling, off of your parents, and also you have very different parents, right? I mean, the parents for Harper were in a very different place than the parents for Deborah. And you
Yeah.
get the sense that, her experience of their world, which was falling apart probably more rapidly for her than it was for Deborah and Pam, it changed her whole outlook about everything too. So it is, and it's in the article that we read, which I do really recommend, talked about how little research is actually done, has
Right.
been done on the sibling aspects of sort of, and we had all that. I'm one of four, and we have all that traditional, like the first is going to be, has to be super smart and the achieving, and then the
Yeah.
second one, I mean, everybody had their, like, this is what you're supposed to do. And of
Yes.
course each role fucked us up in different ways, so we all emerged like, what the hell, it's
Completely. There's no winning because it's like too much attention, not enough attention. Witnessing their parents' marriage in different states. I mean, my brother was only 1 year older than me, so I always had the same That was the era when you'd get the same teacher. So that, my brother was very high achieving. So the first thing every teacher would say is, "I hope you're as good a student as your brother."
no pressure. You're like, no,
Right.
you know, and also, I mean, even and of course, it's like they then expect you to do well in the same things that he achieved highly in, versus maybe your interest and your acuity is somewhere else, and it's like, yeah, you're suddenly a failure, kind of like as you walk in the door. Uh,
Exactly, exactly. And I think, that can play out in friendships too, but I think the family is so much the incubus of all of this, and you never really escape it. And I think that's why for Harper is that like no one ever, her sisters never really took her life seriously because it didn't match theirs, because she's never married, never had kids. She's not straight. She's barely making it because she didn't have these privileges. So I think it sort of created this great tension, which is what you want, when you're
right, of
writing
course, yeah.
built
But it
in.
also exists so, is so much in reality. And there is a sense that those older sisters mother Harper quite a bit, right?
Yeah,
Their
definitely.
mother, as we learn about their parents, it makes more
Yes.
sense. But,
Yeah.
so there's this added responsibility from that Pam and Deborah feel for Harper because she's the baby. And maybe, there's always a sense that she didn't quite turn out right, right? Which, of course, for Harper,
Yes.
is the ultimate, like, well, thanks. And then there's probably, there's obviously in reverse from Harper, there's a sense that she's also falling in line for them to sort of appease that mothering of them, and also resentful of for being mothered as an adult. Like, I mean, it just is like
Completely.
the material almost writes itself, right? I mean,
Yes, yes, completely.
so
Yeah.
when you
Rich.
started this, because there are these three characters are, beautifully drawn. I sense Pam as the main character, maybe because of course we start in her with her sort of point of view, and hers, and her situation with the divorce is sort of the most prevalent. When you start a book, are you somebody who sort of knows, where you're heading? Is it organic? Do you outline? I'm so curious about, and has this changed? I mean, you've written a lot of book, very successfully. So, how does that work for you?
Yeah, that's always who the story, who's at the center of the story and who's telling the story are always the two things it takes me the longest to figure out, because that's really the way in somehow. And you can have an idea and have it fairly worked out, but not know. And I knew that Pam was the center, but I also knew she couldn't be the one telling it. And I do tend to do, this is also true. This is true in many of my books, if I think about it. I often have the ultimate point of view be someone who's watching that
Yeah.
star center. And so that was Harper for me. And it's sort of, I think of it as like the Nick Carraway in it, like from
Oh,
Great Gatsby, because the book is about Gatsby, but Nick is the one telling us, and through telling us about Gatsby, we learn this stuff about, if we're close readers, about Nick. And so that's sort of what I wanted for this, and that that Pam would is the star, but we access her through Harper's complicated gaze.
right. Which is, I mean, right. And that is really powerful. And you're totally right. And actually, yeah, I took that for granted that how much I learned about Harper by hearing about Pam from Harper. Um,
Right.
and so when you start, I mean, we probably interrupted you when you were going to tell us, but so tell us about the process. Are you an outliner?
No, but I do sort of sketch out. I sort of know what the three acts are going to be, in broad terms, and I know the facts of the ending, but I don't know the tone or the feeling or any of that. So it is a lot of figuring stuff out and a lot of revising. In this book in particular, originally I was moving back and forward in time, and then that became, as I got more into the club, the wheel, which is this money making activity they're involved in, that became so intricate that I realized I had to like turn it into linear narrative, because it was it was so juicy, and
Yeah.
I didn't want it. Always the danger of jumping back and forth between two timelines is that the reader starts to get interested in one and not the other one as much. So and you never want to lose, you never want your reader to be like, wait,
Right. Right. Right.
so
Skipping the parts of
yeah,
the past.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So, and then it all fell into place once I just told it. Sometimes the simplest thing is the best thing, and then it did really fall into place, and then it was just a matter um, of getting to know the characters more and knowing what they would do. And so the between things of those three acts start to naturally fall into place, or at least during revision, if not, I do a lot of shuffling. I don't know about you, but revising is a big part for me.
Yeah, well, I think if you're not an outliner, that you sort of you're learning them. Are you learning them by writing about them? It's
Right.
sort of
That's
so
right.
you're writing into it, and then you're sort of stopping and being like, I don't know about you, but I'm 100 pages in and I'm like, oh, something, and I'm like backing up to 60 pages and going, oh, I think this is where but
Yeah.
I can't do
Totally.
that on the spot, right? Are you writing chunks and then revisiting, or you just feel like it's wrong, or how does that
I yeah, I'm thinking about it right now because I'm working on a new book and having just that thing where like I know that this is not in the right space, but I don't know where it goes yet. So I'm just gonna put it here. And then, so I do a lot of revision as I write, but the sequence of like when the reader finds out what they find out is the thing that I always like have to reorder. You want to, I mean, I really sort of obsessively think about the reader, this imaginary reader, and I want them to be with me close the whole
yeah.
time. So I'm always thinking about, is it time to tell them this, or,
Which you
etc.
do beautifully. I mean, there is the risk that you tell them too soon, right? And they feel like then they're disinterested after that, or you tell them too late and they feel cheated.
Right.
It is a very sort of precarious balance to
Yes,
accomplish.
totally, totally. That's what you kind of count your editor on too, because it's very hard you can't unknow what you know. So you don't know when the time is right, sometimes unless you have an outside reader or whoever your first reader is always critical.
So I agree with that 100%. So are you now when you obviously have had the same editor for a while, is that true?
Actually, I have a new editor now, Daphne Durham.
Oh, I've heard that name. I've heard great things.
Yeah, so my editor for the last two books, Great Sally Kim, is moved. So now I had Daphne Durham, whom I had known for years, and it was wonderful. So this was sort of in between. So
Yeah.
I actually had two editors on this book. Um,
How did
so
that go?
I mean, it could have been terrible, but it was
Right.
great.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
it was because they're both so wonderful, but they have slightly different
Mhm.
things that they value, and so it was really useful because I wanted to get that right, get that sort of closeness right.
When you're working on the new book, are you writing the sort of do you write an act and then let someone look at it, or do you sort of get yourself to the end?
I
Has
usually
that
get to
changed? I mean,
Yeah, I usually get to the end.
okay.
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, so occasionally I'll give like up to my agent earlier, but only if I'm panicked. Because yeah, I feel, once you've been doing it a long time, sort of have to trust your own process, even, it's just going to take what it's going to take. I mean, it's very different than working in TV where it's so iterative, where every stage you're turning stuff in. As you mentioned, I'm adapting Dorado Drive now for A24, and so you do a detailed outline of the pilot, and you do drafts, and it's much more collaborative process. So I guess I particularly then like to have the opposite as a balance with a novel where it's mine as long as I want it.
That makes, yeah, I was going to ask about the differences. That of course makes total sense. Are you sort of structuring your time so that you spend, are you working, you must be working on both things sort of simultaneously a little bit.
Yeah.
How does that work for you?
I mean, I have too many, right? Because I haven't worked a lot in TV the last few years, and I have a couple projects, so it's tilted more towards the TV side. So I have to create pockets of a few weeks at a time where I'm only working on the novel. Because as you know, when you're away even for one day or 2 days from your novel, you have to go. It takes forever to get back into it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
crazy. crazy. I always think of it's like, if you're rappelling down a mine shaft, and you have to go back down to the bottom of the mine. And so I really try to, not do it like for one day this, one day this. I really try to do it in blocks.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's sort of like having a friend I think of a novel as like a friend who's in absolute crisis, and you sort of check in every day to make sure she's still
Yes,
okay. And,
totally.
and if you don't check in, you miss 3 days, like everything is just switched on its head.
It's
Um,
a great analogy.
so I'm always like, oh God, I haven't talked to my book. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think it does sound a little crazy probably to people who don't do it, but I do feel like it's that way and it slips away so quickly. So I appreciate that, yeah, you work on it in chunks and you must feel like you get to a place where you have to, it's gotta be hard to leave it, right? If it's not done, do you find you sort of say, okay, I'm gonna get to this place, or is it a matter of like this is all the time I had and now I've got to shift gears?
Sometimes it's just all time ahead. Sometimes I do need to step away from that demanding friend, because I'm in it too, like I've sort of lost sight of it, and then I know if I take a few days and work on something else, I'll have figured something out. But that said, much like you say, it's still happening in my brain. I just read Walter Mosley said something like this, and it's sort of analogous to what you just said, that you have to touch the novel every day. And that might mean reading a little piece of it or thinking about it on your walk or jotting down some notes so that you're still in it, but in some ways you're not, because sometimes you get in a tangle, particularly at very big scenes in the book or the messy middle, as I call it. And it's really helpful to step away. It's sort of like step away from the body or
Yes,
something
exactly. Back
on
up. Right, right, right.
yeah, yeah,
Right. Before you make a bigger mess, just take a
yeah,
step backwards.
completely.
It's funny. I think there are people, and I don't know about you, but there are people who sort of sit at their computer like 8 hours a day. And my agent, who's also an author, Danya Kakafka, does this, where she literally will tie herself to her, on her writing days, because of course she's balancing the two jobs. On her
Yeah,
writing days, she pins herself to her computer, and I am that would make me, I would pull all my hair out. So for me, like writing is oftentimes folding laundry or
yes,
emptying under the sink and scrubbing the corners because I just think I have to be, there's that sort of subconscious that works when you're not at work. And
yes, yes. That's funny. I've heard of a couple editors who are also writers who do the same thing where they lock in. I wonder if it's their editorial training that enables them to do that, because I would lose my mind.
right?
Couldn't do those marathon stretches. Um, I would be writing myself into all kinds of corners. It's something about, you have to know what your process is. And I increasingly try to tell myself that my process is what it is. I can't change. I am what I
Right,
am.
right.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
like, I'd really like to change my process. And you're like, that's
Yeah.
not gonna happen, right? It's like changing your body, eating your
That's
basic
right.
body type. You're like, this is who you are. So you just have to.
Sort of ayahuasca. I don't think.
Yes, right, exactly. I'm not sure what that would do to our work, but there's also the sense of like, I think, when you've achieved success in a pattern, and I try to do something a little different, I also sort of I think there's a lot of like, it's almost like all the superstitions that go into like baseball players, right? You're like, this
Yeah.
works. Tap it 4 times, whatever it is.
Oh my God, the number of superstitions and rituals. I once did a whole panel about that, and all the writers on the panel, we all collected our different ones, and we sounded so deranged, and of course they change because then like a baseball player, like then you hit a slump, and then you have to stop doing all the rituals you were doing
Right.
before,
They're not working
never
anymore.
do it again. Yes, they're banned, and yeah, it's a real derangement. It's such a strange, strange profession.
It is. And it's interesting because I would think that oftentimes TV writers and novelists are quite different, right? Um,
Yeah.
Personality wise. So how is that? You obviously have a huge group of, novel writer friends, and then you also, I'm sure, have wonderful colleagues in TV writing. Do you sense that there's like a sort of difference, or many of them probably are also maybe writing different things? So it's
I think in the last few years there's been a lot more crossover, particularly novelists writing for TV, just because of this sort of explosion with streaming and particularly crime shows. But And then I do know some TV writers who have written novels, but I do think it's a completely different set of writing skills. So you have to think visually, you seem to think so differently. You have to think so much more economically. It's much less interior, because for obvious reasons, you're not whispering in the ear of the reader, so you have to find different ways to convey tone and to help the person understand character. And so it's been, I've been doing it 10 years now, and it's like sometimes I think I'm just starting to figure it out
Right?
because it
Well, that's
is.
fair, right? Your 10,000 hours or whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And so it is, and I think that's why it helps in some ways. If I were working on, God forbid, two novels at once, it would be catastrophic, but because they're so different part of my brain, I think,
right.
operates in them. And so you're thinking more outward when you write TV, and you're
Yeah.
thinking more inward when you
So,
write a
I
novel.
mean, El Dorado Drive is such a, I mean, there's plenty, of course, that happens, externally, but there's such an interior, we're looking at those women in such a sort of deeply interior way. How is it, like, what's the process of, um, of
Yeah.
translating that into film? It's,
It is a challenge, and you have to use your dramatic skills more than your like the easy thing that a lot of people, and I've done it myself when you're adapting, is to use voiceover, which is sort of a cheat. I mean, I think sometimes voiceover is great, and I have done it and I will do it again, but you really can't. It can be a crutch, and it's dangerous. So you have to find other ways to have characters reveal themselves. But there are things that TV and film can do that novels just can't. Because I remember when I was working on Dare Me, the show, and I had written 3-page long scene to convey one of the characters' internal state. And the cinematographer came up to me and she said, "I think that we can do this without any words." And she didn't put it that way, but she knew that if we put, this character in the car at night after this thing had happened to her and pushed in and the lights were right, that the viewer would lean into that character and understand, and the actress would have all these feelings across her face. It's the amazing thing that actors can do. And the music, we would get the right music and the music would swell up. And you're like, wow, that's the whole thing. That's the
and you're like,
beauty.
forget my 3 pages. Let's
Yeah,
just
throw
put
them
it in
out because we can't afford to shoot them anyway. And we'll
Oh my God. Yeah. Now, do you feel like are the things that you've pulled from those experiences in television that now sort of um, work in your stories?
Yes, and I watch television and movies differently. I'll work backwards. Sometimes when I'm working on a script, I'll think of a scene from a movie or a show that was able to get some effect across, and I'll like try to work backwards. Like, how did I have that feeling? What was in the script that made that feeling work? And you sort of try to do that. Like, I have a scene in the Eldorado Drive pilot. That a lot El Dorado Drive is sort of parts of it are a little bit inspired by Goodfellas, uh,
Yes, right.
uh, which is a different criminal enterprise, but
Totally.
I had pitched it as Goodfellas in a country club. So I kept thinking of there's a famous scene in that, the Copacabana scene, where the main characters move through this glamorous nightclub to be seated at their table. And I thought I want a scene like that to convey how enticing this world of luxury is for them. So I sort of figured out a way to do my version of that, much more modified, things like that. Or, there's in the book, a lot of fetishization of luxury items like purses and things like that. And of course, that's made for TV. Like,
Right.
that's just glorious. You can just describe someone looking at this beautiful Louis Vuitton
Yes.
bag. And, yes.
I mean, it's so funny it's so like it does speak. This is another sort of such a female. thing that we do is these like sort of status symbols that we wear all over our bodies, from, from the labels to the jewelry to the way we do our hair to how much Botox is in our,
Yes,
it's
yes.
all of it, right? And I think I kind of love that this book is, I mean, there are, of course, men. I particularly, of course, love Pam's, son, and Perry, who is Deborah's husband. But largely, it is a female book, and I love those moments when we're at the houses of the women who are hosting, and there's just all this, everybody, you can just feel the money burning in their pockets. They want to spend it, and of course they do, and
Yes,
so
exactly.
we're not going to tell you, it's
Yeah.
so wonderfully done, and it is the thing that I think about your books, Megan, which I'm sure many people have told you before, but one of the things I feel like is that we are living this like wonderfully paced story on the outside, and on the inside we are just getting this, just such a complete feeling of the characters that are in it, we're recognizing ourselves in those characters, which
Oh,
I
good.
so appreciate, even the least attractive things, right, about them, mostly probably the least attractive things about them. I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. And I feel like the authenticity, and then you sort of balance that with this really wonderfully paced story that we can't put down. So kudos. That's so powerful.
Thank you. That's what you always hope. And I do think, like, with our female characters, when you're writing crime novels, is where you lay all your own dark secrets bare. You can put into any character all the things we dislike about ourselves, or our bad feelings, and then so I think why they say crime writers are the nicest, because we get it all out on the page.
Is that true? Romance writers are the meanest and crime writers are the nicest. That would make sense, I
Don't
guess.
speak to romance writers,
Well,
but
no, yeah, I just made that up. Right. But yeah, I think the outlet of it, and it's funny. I mean, like, so were you? I mean, I'll let you go here shortly because I know you're doing a million things, but I want to hear. Were you writing crime from the start, and how, did you ever sort of think, why am I drawn to this, and how did you start in this business?
Yeah, my first book, I don't think I really knew it was a crime novel, though it clearly was. I mean, it had a crime in it, but I never thought in genre terms, like, because I read everything, probably like we all did. If you're a reader, you're a reader. But then it was published as a crime novel, and I never had any desire to write a book without crime in it. I think it reveals so much about character and psychology. It's an engine, it's a plot engine, and it gives us so much freedom. But why I'm interested in crime is something I think about all the time, and I talk about it with other crime writers all the time, because I don't know about you, but when I was a little kid, I would want to read the true crime paperbacks at the drugstore. I mean, I just never stopped being interested in it, and it's nice when you meet other crime writers and you can feel a little less unwholesome because they're not the same way.
I do think nobody shows their true colors like they do when they're in a corner,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
I mean, trapped in a corner is when you just, you see exactly who that person is, and whether it's a metaphorical corner or a real corner. And I think that's what makes this, you just don't get higher than these stakes, right? When the stakes are, and I love, as I've gotten older, and I love that you really are investigating women in their 40s and 50s, and because I think now it's like this is a whole different corner. The corner I was in when I had like a newborn, or when I was in my 20s, or in those books, I still love to read that. But when I read a book about a woman who's my age, I'm just like, yes, like you have to you're reinventing yourself all the time.
Yeah,
And society's paying less and less attention to you, right? Because you're not
yeah,
meeting.
right. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah, but I agree with you. I think crime is, and mine were more like, Agatha Christie, but I mean, like I read the Boxcar Kids, and even,
Yeah.
even the sort of like the sort of Dire Straits, any character in Dire Straits was always like
Yes.
the most interesting character. So
Absolutely. Yes. No, I read all the Agatha Christie too. I just couldn't get enough. And I think, there's something sort of like this as a kid. it's trying to understand about adulthood, and how the world works. I guess we did.
Yeah, we did. And as soon as and as soon as I discovered sort of the darker, Agatha Christie was like, that was like, when I just started to discover the darker stuff, I was like, oh, wow, this is
Yeah, yeah,
so,
yeah.
so interesting. But yeah, I think it is and it's still sometimes how I try to understand adulthood. And I
Same,
felt
same.
for a really long time, but I'm still trying to figure it out. So, oh, Megan, what an absolute thrill to get a chance to talk to
Oh,
you. Um,
thank you.
I'm so excited about El Dorado Drive. And if you're not watching the show, you got to go look at the cover too, because I think they did an incredible job with the cover. I love the tear and everything that, I guess this is the picture we're looking at. If
That's
you
right. That's right.
the houses and the but anyway, and what a great title. I mean, it just sounds and they talk about sort of how, this little neighborhood of,
Yeah.
wealthy sounding
Yes. Aspirational street name.
aspirational street names. I love that. So anyway, it was such a thrill to have you on the show. Everybody, this is Megan Abbott and Killer Women, and we will see you next time. Bye.